Hey, this is Ed Robertson, and this is the Mountain and Prairie podcast, where I introduce you to some of the innovative and creative individuals who are helping to shape the future of the American West. I meet most of these people through my work in ranch brokerage and land conservation, or through my hobbies and interests that revolve around spending time in the mountains. My guests include ranchers, writers, entrepreneurs, conservationists, athletes, artists, pretty much anyone who's doing important work and has an interesting story to tell. My guest today is Pat O'Toole. Pat is a rancher who, along with his family, owns and operates the Ladder Ranch, a large-scale cattle and sheep operation that straddles the Colorado-Wyoming border. Pat's wife Sharon's family established the ranch in the Little Snake River Valley back in 1881, and now, 6 generations later, the family's hard work, thoughtful vision, and deep respect for the land have made the Ladder Ranch a shining example of the combined effect of productive agriculture and land conservation. Pat's background is far outside the norm for many multi-generational ranchers. He grew up in South Florida, majored in philosophy in college, and then just before he and his wife enrolled in law school, at the very last minute they decided to return to her family's land to continue in the family business of ranching. Since then, the O'Tooles have not only run a financially successful operation, but they've simultaneously improved wildlife, bird, and fish habitat throughout the ranch. By thinking outside the box and partnering with both nonprofit and governmental organizations, the Ladder Ranch has set a new standard for conservation, creative problem solving, and sustainable land stewardship. We had a fun, in-depth conversation that covered a wide variety of topics that will be of interest to anyone who loves the West, whether you're involved in ranching or not. We discussed Pat's thoughts on cooperation between ranchers and environmentalists, and how the relationship between the two groups is getting stronger and more positive every year. We chat about water in the West, and why it's important to keep water on ranches rather than being sold off to municipalities. We also dig into Pat's unconventional background, his thoughts on the future of land conservation, and of course, favorite books, history, and his favorite location in the West. I connected with Pat over the phone, and over the course of the interview, you'll get a good appreciation for just how family-focused his ranch is. You'll hear his kids and grandkids coming and going in the background, which I thought was very, very cool. It's rare to get to work with generations of your family members in any capacity, much less on such a spectacular Rocky Mountain ranch for well over 100 years. As you'll see, Pat is a super interesting guy who's thought very deeply on issues related to the American West, including conservation, water, agriculture, and much more. There's a lot of great information in this interview, so I hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, well, we describe ourselves as we raise cattle, sheep, horses, dogs, and children, and occasionally expectations.
Sure.
So, that we're ranchers on the Colorado-Wyoming line, and have an irrigated farming part of our operation, and then we raise Rambouillet sheep and Angus Baldy cows.
So your ranch has been in your family for generations now. Can you kind of give a overview of when your predecessors settled there in that area, and just kind of an overview of the history of the ranch?
Sure. Well, actually, it's my wife's family has been here since 1881. And if anybody's read or seen Lonesome Dove, her great-grandfather came up on a couple of cattle trails, and then was working in a winter down by Steamboat Springs at Hans Peak and in a mine, and he met a Scotsman that was an engineer that financed him, and he put together a crew of people in Eagle Pass, Texas, and gathered up several hundred horses and trailed them up here. And that's how the ranch started. It was raising horses for the Army. And so they'd bring in Belgian studs from on a train and breed them to these horses that they brought up, and that was the first edification of how this started. But as you probably know, the thing that I think people don't really understand is the history of why the West is like it is. And you have to go back to Lincoln in 1862 and the Homestead Act, and that pretty much set the path of what was going to happen. So this ranch started with a 160-acre homestead.
Yep.
And that wasn't at all sustainable.
Sure.
And so I call it the world's greatest example of social Darwinism, because the ranches that are here today are the ones that survived, and this ranch is made up of quite a few homesteads that didn't survive one way or another.
Well, could you describe that or talk about that a little more in detail? Because I think a lot of people, especially people who live on the East Coast, don't really understand that. Because on the East Coast, 160 acres is a huge amount of land, and you could raise plenty of cows or plenty of any kind of livestock on 160 acres because they get so much rain. Can you talk about how 160 acres just isn't sufficient in the West and why?
Well, one, it depends on where it is. Two, you've got a huge public land component. And so the initial people came out, it was kind of free grazing, and it was, the people with the most horsepower, were able to graze the most land. Mm-hmm. And, it evolved into, personalities and marketing capability and survival. Yep. But out here, irrigation's a huge deal. And so the water rights system started sort of in the mining business, but it ended up being, the sort of the premise for all of Western irrigated and then Western law. And it's called prior appropriation. It means the first in use, first in right, first in use. So that means that the first people that used it for what they call beneficial use, so if you put it on land to make hay or crops, that's a beneficial use. And, that if you maintain that use, you maintain that water right. Mm-hmm. And so this ranch has 1880s territorial water rights, and then others that came later that, we just kept building up our acres and water rights. And so now we have the ability to irrigate about 600 acres of hayland that we produce for our cattle and sheep, and then for grazing later in the system. But we also have a pretty good fishery, and our mountain lands, our riparian river lands, are all in a national important bird area with Audubon. Mm-hmm. And we're just trying to show how over a period of time we've been able to put together a ranch that is still surviving, and as time goes on, you can see that the land can do a whole lot of things. So we feel like the conservation part of what we do is a pretty important part. It's also part of a business model. My daughter has a kind of multifaceted, it's not a huge business, but it's a business model that helps us with some cash flow, and at the same time, during hunting season and during fishing during the summer, it's just some additional income.
Sure. We spoke about this a little bit on the phone last week, but one of the things I run into a lot is I live in Boulder, and Boulder is a hotbed for environmentalism, and there are a lot of very well-meaning environmentalists here who think that ranchers and environmentalists cannot see eye to eye on things, and they think that livestock is not good for the land, and they've got a serious misunderstanding there. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I know that you work between both groups, and you were actually at a conference a few weeks ago that is heavily attended by environmentalists, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on, first of all, how ranching can be great for the environment, how it's needed in this part of the world, and then just how you've seen the two groups kind of come together over time.
Right. Well, there's in the old movies, they always talk about how the sheep-cattle wars happened because the sheep grazed the grass this way and the cows grazed the grass another way, and it's all untrue. Mm-hmm. If you put too many animals, I don't care if it's buffalo or giraffes or zebras, if you put too many, they'll overgraze. Yes. And so the philosophy of the land is that, one, it's always been grazed. There's always been grazing animals. And when you understand how the grasses work, we feel like for our operation, and this isn't everybody, because you can do either, cattle or sheep separately and do it. But when you do both, cattle eat mostly grass with some browse. Browse is like sagebrush or, broadleaf plants. and sheep eat mostly forbs and grass. So they have an overlap, but if you do both correctly, you can get 40% more utilization, whether that be pounds or time or whatever you're trying to do on doing both, which is what we do.
Sure.
And so we do rotations, and then we do pretty big movement. Our animals graze in the national forest and on private lands up in the forest area in the summer, but then the sheep trail 150 miles to a desert area north of I-80 that is generally open for snow, and they're able to graze all winter. And then we run the cows. They eat hay until the green grass comes. And so we're trying to utilize lands both in a big rotation in the summer, not using the same land all summer, rotating around, and at the same time, the summer country doesn't get used from the middle of June, from the 1st of October to the middle of June, because we're not on there then. And you obviously have wildlife and, elk and deer and antelope grazing and, all kinds of wildlife. But from the rancher perspective, we don't use it till it grows up to a certain, height and that's our big circle. It's just like, a big balanced rotation is how we look at it. And so when you're doing it, two things I think are really the most important. One, if you don't have ranchers, and there was a Forest Service lady in Steamboat that said the worst grazer is better than the best subdivision, and that's the truth. Once you break up ranches and people that are using the land, it's pretty easy to see what happens. So
Sure.
go to any kind of recreation, ski area, whatever, and watch the houses move out, and you lose all that habitat. And for example, in Colorado, there was a vote years ago to not do trapping. Well, now there's somewhere near 9 times more bears than habitat in the state of Colorado. So bears are getting into homes and, breaking into camps and whatever, because there's more bears than there are habitat. And that's the case with, kind of management of livestock or wildlife or whatever. You got to try to find that balance. And so we have been, for years, have a lot of friends that are, self-described conservationists, and we think we are too. And in the 90s, during Bruce Babbitt and the first Clinton administration, when things were so contentious, it was a real dividing line. But over time, I think, I have this saying about the hopefuls and the hatefuls. And the hopefuls are the people that I've been working with for decades now, who we are doing more neat projects than you can imagine. And the haters are the litigators who don't want solutions. They want all the people off the land and think that'll, be a better result. The reality is, when you lose people that are taking care of the land and raising food, it goes in a direction that isn't good for conservation or for food production or for open spaces or for any of those things.
Sure.
And we're watching that in Colorado in a big way, and I had a guy come up the other day, real smart guy from Fort Collins, and we were talking about a bunch of different things, and he had no idea that the water that grows the eastern slope comes from the western slope. and it's the same all over Colorado. People don't realize that we're tapping the western slope for the growth of the eastern slope.
Sure.
And I would say, and this is where I think it's all going to get interesting. I mean, you've got a lot of agendas. Obviously, conservation is one, agriculture, food production is one, rural communities is one, urban growth is one. And so we've kind of come to the era of limits. I describe it as the era of limits. We don't have unlimited water, unlimited land. The only thing we're limiting ourselves on is farmers and ranchers who, are going the wrong direction. I think I told you the other day, the fastest growing category of people in agriculture is 70 and above, and only 35% of farmers only 6% of farmers are under 35. That doesn't work.
Sure.
That's not sustainable, and yet that's the direction we're moving in. And so we're, politically, I just saw a thing the other day from an urban group kind of demonizing farmers and ranchers for the way they use their water because they want it. Mm-hmm. And there's some ugly discussions going on right now, and yet there's a lot of coalitions between agriculture and conservation because you can sure show how you can do both. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of what we prided ourselves and our community does. So things that are typically, kind of been described as bad, like storage, especially now, we're getting into a drier cycle, a warmer cycle, where we're seeing the water runoff earlier. Mm-hmm. Well, if you don't do small storage all over the West, you're not going to have rivers. That's just the way it'll be.
Sure.
And so, not doing anything is doing something.
Yeah, that's a choice. It's a choice.
Yeah,
to
it's
do
a
nothing.
choice. And so we're working in this community to put in our second significant storage reservoir up here high in the mountains so that we can have both irrigated agriculture and fisheries and migratory bird hatching in the spring and all those things. And if you don't understand the hydrology, you're going to make some big mistakes. And I think what we're seeing is that these dialogues between, people that are conservation-minded and agriculture, in its best sense, are really positive. Mm-hmm. Because we're trying to figure out how to do both. And it isn't just the age thing. I mean, it doesn't matter whether it's the United Nations or the most conservative food analysis in the world. We've got to double the food supply to deal with 9.7 billion people.
Yep.
And so you have to start making choices. I live in a place where you can do both fairly easily. I mean, we can have all the birds in the world and the fish and the cattle and the sheep, and we've got a great landscape. Some landscapes, in the Central Valley of California or, places where the food capability is so incredibly prolific, maybe you weight it heavier for food. In some places you weight it heavier for conservation, but you're trying to find a balance. And I guess, Ed, I think I describe it as a platform that's rising that you do both. Mm-hmm. And instead of choosing, one over the other, you're trying to do as much of both as you can because the country can only have so much capability. But I think we've only tapped, how much coordinated and, people working together is out there. There's just so much opportunity. There's more than a lifetime, in my view, in my ranch, our family's ranch. And so we're pretty excited about all the things we still get to do. And I think that's, when people start looking at it, you've got limits on one level. You've got growth pushing the transition of water away from agriculture, which will have huge impacts on wildlife. Mm-hmm. And we are going to have to start making some hard decisions. So,
well, we could continue to dig into all that, and I'd like to talk more about especially the water part because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. That's interesting what you said about the guy from Fort Collins because I run into that all the time. People who are very smart, very interested, highly educated, but some of the most basic parts of how things work out here in the West, they just don't know. They have no idea. And so I would like to talk more about that. But I'd also, before we dig into that, I know you've got a interesting personal background that's not your stereotypical multi-generational rancher background. So where did you grow up and where did you go to school and how did you end up on the Ladder Ranch?
Well, it's a long and winding trail, but my four grandparents came from Ireland in the turn of the century, some through Scotland, but, basically all Irish people that, tried one generation after the potato famine, and then they went to Pittsburgh to work in the steel mills, actually.
Okay.
And then my family kind of moved around, and I was actually raised in South Florida and went to school there for a while and ultimately decided I wanted to not be there, and the growth today pretty much is why.
Yep.
But I ended up going to school in Fort Collins.
Okay.
And my wife and I both worked for the Collegian as editors, and and we met there, and we were going to go to law school, and we both were accepted at the University of Wyoming Law School to be water lawyers was sort of our thought.
Yep.
And the day school started, we had been here for the summer on the ranch, and we liked it, and I sure liked it. And her dad, talked about maybe there would be a place if we were interested. So the day school started, we gave our 2 places to somebody, and ended up herding sheep for 3 years. We bought a bunch of sheep with no teeth, and old sheep or old cows, the way you tell they're getting old is their teeth disappear.
Uh-huh.
And you can buy old sheep, and if you take really good care of them, get another year out of them here. So we did that and sort of learned that part of the business, and then learned, sort of the total business, putting up hay and running cows, and so here we are.
Was it was that a hard decision, or did you feel in your gut that was the thing to do, or how did you come to that decision? That's quite a U-turn.
I always tell people that all the lawyers said buy livestock, and all the livestock people said go be a lawyer. So it wasn't like there was any help there. But we really, this is a beautiful spot, and we should talk a little bit about Sharon's dad, who was really a genius guy.
Yeah, I've read about it. It sounds unbelievably
rotational grazing systems in the 40s, and he had an education in range management from CSU, and he just started thinking things through. And I mentioned earlier the 1862 Lincoln deal. Well, the other big thing was when Roosevelt took all the lands that hadn't been homesteaded and put them into the forest and the BLM in 1906. Mm-hmm. And so the lands were still kind of used not in the best way. There was a lot of overgrazing. There was no regulation. And until the mid-30s, and all the things that happened in the Oklahoma and the Dust Bowl and all that stuff, during the Roosevelt administration, a whole lot of things started happening that you live with today, and I think mostly positive in that, the Soil Conservation Service, which is now the NRCS, actually a neighbor from Hayden, Colorado, a guy that was a lawyer in Hayden, went around the whole West and put together all the grazing allotments, mm-hmm. so that they were official, and your family knew what you had, and everybody had their own, and there were rules that went along with it. And that began a phase, that people were still, accumulating and moving forward, the ones that survived. But, it tells you now what we have is, fairly, not totally, but fairly stable systems of ownership of, private land and public land. If you have enough public land to go with your private land, you can probably run a sustainable operation. Mm-hmm. And that's what we've tried to do. So,
yeah, that all makes sense. When you're looking back at your father-in-law and some of the stuff he was able to figure out and do, before this stuff had become mainstream, like rotational grazing, is there any particular project or idea that you look back and you just wonder, how in the world did he figure that out?
Well, there was some country in the Medicine Bow National Forest now that's above us that we graze now, and some of our neighbors, and it had been used pretty darn hard. And the company, it was, I think in 1948, George had been a tank commander with Patton in World War II. Mm-hmm. And, he had a pretty strong personality, and he came back and he looked at this ruined country in 1948, this pretty big sheep outfit put their sheep up on the forest to have lambs the 1st of May. Well, this country isn't ready for that at that time. Mm-hmm. And they had a storm. They said the snow was up to the wagon, the old wooden-wheeled wagons up to the doors, and killed everything. And so when they went out of business, that was when there was an opportunity to put together some of this country in a different way. And several of the neighbors up here in George got together and made big pastures, did a lot of weed control, spraying, rotational grazing with sheep and cattle. And all of a sudden it went from being really used hard to to what it is today. And what it shows you is the resilience of the land. And the lessons I've learned is how if you give nature a chance, the resiliency inherent in nature is pretty amazing.
Yes.
And so, the idea that something has been used incorrectly or whatever doesn't mean that it's always going to be like that. I think it means that let's look and see what we can do to make it better.
Sure.
And that's sort of the philosophy that we're trying to do. We just look at our land, and there's lots of things we still want to do, but you can't do everything at once. But the other part is, the grandchildren are the sixth generation here, and we're trying to teach them the things that might not get done in this generation, but maybe they'll get them done.
Yeah, that's great. We were talking before we started recording that I've got a little 1-year-old daughter, and so I'm always interested to hear how people get that conservation mindset ingrained in children at an early age. Are there any specific lessons you can give me as a father and grandfather?
Well, what you find is if you just talk about cows, that's all they'll talk about until they get older. But if you talk about cows and fish and birds and sheep and horses and dogs, they'll talk about all those things. And so, when you're working with your border collies and training them, the kids see that and they see what the interrelationship is, So we just have this new puppy that my wife has, and she's the daughter of my really good dog, and my son has a tremendous stud dog. And so we knew that she had all the genetics in the world. And this weekend we were working cows, and she's just a little puppy, just barely weaned. And the first little bunch of cows we pushed out of this corral, we were, branding and taking off horns and stuff like that. And we used the good dog to push them out. Well, from then on, every time a calf would come out, she just pushed it out and followed it just perfectly. And you can't teach that. They
Sure.
either have it or they don't. But everybody at the ranch is talking about it. Isn't it cool how Cora has all of this stuff? And you just know how good a dog she's going to be because she's got it. She's got that thing. Well, it's the same thing, good horses or we sorted out the bulls we're going to keep. And so you're choosing between the good ones and the not so good ones, or, the sheep, or raising the right kind of wool, and they're the ones that are the meat sheep, are they the right kind? So it's just, trying to teach all the pieces, and pretty soon they start figuring stuff out and have ideas that are better than yours sometimes.
Yeah, it's definitely, I'm only 15 months in, but it's a cool experience. So one other question about kind of your personal background. Do you have any role models or mentors? It sounds like your father-in-law is a huge mentor, but they could be alive or dead, people you've met or maybe have not met, writers. Are there any people you look to as a great example that you try to follow as you pursue ranching?
Well, this guy I mentioned that went around and put together the grazing allotments. Mm-hmm. He was an East Coast guy that moved out here, became a lawyer, and then went and worked for the Roosevelt administration. Ferry Carpenter is his name, and I'm rereading a book called Confessions of a Maverick.
Oh, I've got that on my shelf actually. Eric Glenn.
Man.
Eric Glenn gave it to me and told me I needed to read it, and I haven't read it yet.
That is a great book. So you have a guy like that, or our family was very fortunate to win the Leopold Award, so I've read a lot about, Aldo Leopold.
Yep.
Obviously that's an example. And we have the really great system in this valley. And all the things I talked about in the 30s, we have to deal with multiple federal agencies. And we're right on the state line. So the original homestead was right on the state line. So we evolved into being both states.
Yep.
Well, in one way that's good, but in another way it's 2 Forest Service and 2 BLMs and 2 Game and Fish and 2, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And so we have a tremendous regulatory world that we have to live in, and trying to figure that out is almost becoming the most difficult part of what we do. And so, trying to think about, a philosophy of making things simpler doing things logically. And what we have in this valley is we have a really good NRCS. That's the Department of Agriculture that, conservation districts. The whole United States, every piece of land is covered by a conservation district, even the cities. Mm-hmm. And it's how you do the conservation within those borders. Well, they're not all great, but we have a great one. And we have a great elected board of our conservation district board. Our daughter is on it. Mm-hmm. We have a leader here in this community who is the best conservationist I've ever been around. He's also a state senator here in Wyoming.
What is his name?
Larry Hicks.
Okay.
And he's just a legendary guy, and he sees the world in a very complete way that is unique in my experience. And so one of the things he did north of Baggs, Wyoming, out in which you would drive through and say, boy, just a big old desert. Well, he took a desert tributary and over the last 20 years or so made it into the largest man-made wetland in Wyoming. And it's 3,500 acres that's integrated with a lot of irrigated grazing for the landowners. Mm-hmm. And the bird numbers went from 29 species to 140, and it's on the Continental Divide, so it becomes part of the Atlantic and Pacific Flyway.
That's great.
And it is an incredible story, of integrating production agriculture and conservation. And we're doing that all up and down this watershed, and it's why, when you see how it can work when it's working right, it's pretty cool. And like I said, not everybody, has all the leadership and the people in place, but we do in a pretty big scale. And, gives you a lot of confidence for the kind of things that you can do.
Sure. Back to the water aspect, I've interviewed a lot of people on this podcast, and I think I told you this, that I'd say about 85%, 80-90% of the people I've interviewed, when I ask them what's the biggest challenge facing the West, they say water. And they're not in the ranching business. A few of them are, but a lot of them are either athletes or they're artists, at the full spectrum. And everybody seems to know that water is going to be the big issue, becoming more and more of an issue. And so, but the reality is that nobody really understands it and understands why it's going to be such an issue. So could you, one of the issues we run into is that people or municipalities are buying water from ranchers and drying up ranchers' meadows and pumping that water to cities. And so can you talk a little bit about that and why that is not the solution or not the complete solution to the water issues in the West?
Well, the first part is that if you keep doing it, you inevitably run out, so you can't do it anymore. Mm-hmm. So do we want to decide not to run out now, or do we want to wait till we run out?
Yeah, you're just delaying the inevitable.
Yeah, you're delaying an inevitable, and you're essentially, this transfer of water from the western slope to the eastern slope, this valley has the only transbasin diversion in Wyoming, so water from here goes to Cheyenne. Mm-hmm. And we've spent decades fighting for storage to make up for that water we lost. And there's, sometimes it happens and sometimes it doesn't. It's called, basin of origin protection. That means that if you take water from a basin, you should at the very least do storage, to make up so that late in the year that water that would have been percolating through the system is there. But it's very complicated, obviously. I'm president of the board of a group called the Family Farm Alliance. Mm-hmm. And we represent irrigators in the 17 western states, testify to Congress quite a bit, write papers on policy, and are pretty involved in these discussions. And when you're looking at all the West, kind of cumulatively, it's really interesting how, the fights in Colorado are the same as the fights in, Nevada or Kansas or North Dakota. Everybody is coming to the realization there's only so much water, and what are we going to do, especially if we're into a drier cycle or a warmer cycle. Mm-hmm. And if it's a warmer, wetter cycle, which sometimes you think it is, you do X. If it's a warmer, drier cycle, you do Y. Or if it's a, intense storm, which I think there's certainly a lot of evidence of that. You've got to make agriculture resilient, and so by and dry, which is what happened in the Arkansas Valley in Colorado, people now realize that was not a good idea. Mm-hmm. And you drive through there and you look at those what used to be fertile agricultural farms and stuff. It isn't clearly not where we want to go. You go to South Park, which is Fairplay, which in '98 their water went to Aurora. That used to be this huge irrigated hay and wildlife, and now it isn't. It's all dried up. Mm-hmm. And so we have plenty of examples that are decades old, and I think, I describe it as, do you want the Colorado you want, or do you want the one you deserve? Mm-hmm. And that's the case all over the West, and so when you have Harry Reid, who's, about to leave the Senate, wanting to put $50 million into paying farmers and ranchers not to farm a ranch so that, look at it, Las Vegas can grow more. Mm-hmm. That doesn't seem to make sense to me. No. And the beauty of where I'm at is I get to defend farmers and ranchers. It's pretty easy. I know where my values are, and I don't have to, get too deep into the subconscious. But the reality is where a lot of policymakers are conflicted because people didn't move to Boulder or Fort Collins or Denver from somewhere else for the city as much as they did to be able to know that Colorado has, lots of wildlife and fish and open meadows and beautiful ranches and farms. That's what they enjoy, and all the wildlife that goes with it. Mm-hmm. And if you don't understand, not just as, people say, well, you use too much water for food. Well, you use the amount of water it takes to make the food.
Exactly.
But if you do it, like we're trying to do here, and there's all kinds of different ways to do it. But here, if you flood irrigate, which we do on 2/3 of our land.
Can you explain for people who don't know what that means? What that means? That
means you divert water from a river into ditches, and then there's all these ditch systems, and you flood the field. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, you can make an argument that it mimics what the beavers did.
Sure.
Because but what that did is it recharged the aquifer also, because that water percolates. So the water you're putting on, it's called return flow, and then it goes back into the system. And I'm on several conservation boards, and one of them is this Intermountain joint venture that does migratory birds in the West. Mm-hmm. So the heads of all the game agencies and the Fish and Wildlife and BLM and ranchers and Audubon and others are all, working on how do we maintain those numbers. Well, it's clear, and they just have done several years of studying, that flood irrigation is why we have the migratory birds in the West that we do, because they're hatching in these meadows, these wet meadows in the spring, and then the rancher is getting hay afterward, and it's sort of a symbiotic system. Mm-hmm. And I have this saying, it's called the myth of efficiency, and that's that sprinklers or super efficient use of water is the future. Well, what you do when you take water away from the wet meadow system is you dry up the rivers, because you're not recharging the aquifer. You're using all the water consumptively. Mm-hmm. And so the reality is you got to find that balance where, in my view, I mean, this is my personal view, obviously, but I think, when you're doing as many things as you can with that land and maintaining its open spaces, that's where, a Colorado or a Montana or Idaho, that's where we want to be. We want to be able to live in a place that you can see, that balance. And I guess I feel pretty strongly, that we're looking at Colorado. To me, the Fort Collins Greeley corridor is changing so fast, and it's gone. Greeley's a Weld County. It used to be the second biggest ag county in the United States, mm-hmm. and it's just turning into pavement.
Sure.
Nobody feels good about that, really, except the developers. And I talked to a water meeting last week, and I said, how come there's never a developer at these meetings that goes, to the water managers and say, I want to put 1,000 houses here, find me the water. They don't care about any of these things I'm talking about or you are interested in. but they're the ones that are driving the system.
Mm-hmm.
And we're at a point now where we're changing the whole system for the growth system, and I don't know. It's kind of coming to a interesting conflict-laden future.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be interesting. There's no question about that. And it seems to me that there's just, for some reason, there's just a lack of education on it. I mean, I feel like I know more than most, but I know the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. And so you think about people who have no desire to learn about any of this stuff. It's just, I think there's going to be a turning point where people are going to learn the hard way. So one thing I like about everything you say there, though, is that you acknowledge that it's unbelievably complicated and that there are different answers for different circumstances. And I think, some groups, they want there to be a very simple answer that applies to all situations, like get the people out of here or get the cows out of here. But nothing's that simple. Everything's complicated. And so, anyway, I really appreciate how deeply you think on that subject and how you can communicate it, because more people need to hear it.
The other part, though, I talked about the developers being a driver. The other are the lawyers and the law schools. And, there's a lot of people trying to figure out how to change the law so that it would be easier for cities and to some extent environment to get the water from the farmers and ranchers. It's that simple. It's a very complicated deal on one level, but it's simple on another. And I'm one of those guys that will protect the prior appropriation doctrine, because it isn't just about the farmer and rancher part. It's a system that makes us hesitate to just do the easy thing, and that's turn all the water to growth.
Sure.
Because that's where the money is. And people say, water needs to go to the highest best use. Well, the highest best use is mixed with Scotch in Las Vegas.
Yeah.
Is that how we're going to determine the future of the West? I don't think so.
Sure. Could you talk a little bit about, you mentioned it briefly, the Leopold Award that your family won for your ranch, and I'll put a link to the video and to the webpage, but I think that's a really neat award that's gone to some great folks. And could you just talk about that for a moment? Sure.
There's a group called the Sand County Foundation that is out of Wisconsin and does a lot of policy work, and it's obviously based on the philosophy of Aldo Leopold, and they choose a rancher in a western state every year, and it is to us the greatest honor to have received it, and it talks about how you do this balance, how we have to raise food. And we have to keep the landscape open if we can, but we do it in a way that melds with the conservation part. And it's a real stimulus. People now are going, well, how do I get one? Mm-hmm. What do I have to do to my operation to get one? The other thing is the winners are accumulating together, and there's several forums. I was at a Farm Bill forum in California recently with a whole bunch of Leopold winners. And so you get this interconnectedness of people talking about conservation in a real way, and you're always learning how somebody else did it. That was one of my father-in-law's sayings: go see somebody else's place, you'll learn something. Because there's something that happens on a ranch that doesn't happen all over America like it used to, and that's that we're an hour and a half from town, any town. If something breaks, you're first going to try to fix it yourself. Mm-hmm. And what I've been the most amazed at is the when the human mind is faced with a challenge that you really need to solve if you can, how innovative people are. And so you have these experiences are happening every day all over the West or all over the United States, wherever there's farmers or the world, where people are solving problems for themselves. And the Leopold thing just takes it to another level, because you're sitting around with people who have, through a level of criteria that Sand County comes up with, have just done things in a way that, they're sitting on their tractor, sitting on their horse, or sitting on a rock by a river, and they go, what, if I do this a little different, these things will happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the most exciting part. It's so inspiring. And then I'm also on the board of a group called Partners for Conservation. And it's important for people to understand how important the Endangered Species Act is. And it's, often used as a blunt club and is not really effective. California is dealing with a thing called the Delta Smelt, which is essentially de-watering and deconstructing one of the greatest agricultural places in the world. I'm involved in the sage grouse thing, and our family has a lot of sage grouse, and we can see how working together works a lot better than conflict and litigation.
Yes.
And so the Partners for Conservation is a group of ranchers and farmers that's becoming nationwide that works with the Fish and Wildlife Partners Group. That's separate from the Ecological Service part, which is the listers. And we're having great discussions about what is the future? Is the future conflict or is the future partnership? And it, sort of comes that whole piece, the Leopold part, the Sand County part, the partners part, this kind of vision of, we're running into an era of limits. How do we partner with each other to come up with the best solutions?
I'm always happy to hear about people partnering and trying to come up with solutions versus fighting, but it makes me especially happy given this insane election we're in the middle of right now.
Right. Oh, man.
I want to be respectful of your time. We're at about 45 minutes now, and so there's some questions that I've asked all my guests, and I've gotten some really interesting answers, and so I'd like to run through those with you real quick. They're relatively quick questions, but you don't have to give a quick answer. One that I'm especially interested to hear from you, because we talked about books for a while the other day, is do you have any favorite books or books that you always recommend to others related to the American West or related to any subject?
That what I mentioned earlier, Larry McMurtry's book on Lonesome Dove.
That is so good.
It is so good.
I never read fiction, and that is one of my favorite books of all time, even though, I never read fiction. It. I love it.
Yeah. I just finished this really a great book called Jefferson's America, which is about not just Lewis and Clark, but various people he sent out to explore. And one of the things I didn't know, Zebulon Pike discovered the headwaters of the Mississippi River. Didn't discover them like, people had been there, trappers, but from the official perspective of the government, learning the parameters of the Louisiana Purchase, and then went west and Santa Fe Trail and all that. That's been a really great book that I've read recently. And then I'm reading also that there's a book on Teddy Roosevelt after his mother and wife died on the same day.
Yes.
He moved out to the Badlands, and there's a really great book on it that I'm reading.
Is it Theodore Roosevelt in the Badlands?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've read that. God, that's a really good
terrific
one. Have you read Wilderness Warrior about Theodore Roosevelt?
I have, yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah, that's the one where he and, what's his name?
Pinchot?
No, the other guy that wanted to keep Yosemite.
Oh, John Muir.
John Muir, yeah. And they spent 3 days together, and at the end, John Muir said he doesn't even know his bird songs or something like that. And I thought, no matter what level you're at, there's jealousy. But that was a great book too.
Yeah, that was a good one. I can't get enough Theodore Roosevelt, but I love that time period when he's in the West. What a neat guy.
Another book that's really cool is the Apache Wars.
I have not read that one.
And it's fairly new, but it's about, obviously it's not just centered on Cochise and Geronimo, but the entire process from the, pre-settlement all the way through to, the ultimate bad deal that happened. But it's really good.
I'll check that out because I read one by Hampton Sides called Blood and Thunder about the Navajos. Yep. And that's one of the best books I've ever read, ever. And it got me interested. I wish I had more time.
Right. Well, come on up. I got a great library here.
I'll take you up on that. I really will. Are there any
really quickly? Let me just tell you. This Ferry Carpenter, his ranch is now owned by the Nature Conservancy in Hayden, Colorado.
Okay.
That library is the best Western library I've ever seen. And if you go up there, Jeff Blakely runs the ranch. and he'll let you go in there and look around. And I will tell you, it is amazing.
Is it really?
It's amazing. Yeah.
I didn't even know that was up there. That gives me an excuse to make a trip up that way. Do you have any documentaries or films that you like, or I don't know how you might not have time to, with everything else you're doing, to watch movies, but any that stand out?
Well, the movie that Robert Duvall and all, on Lonesome Dove,
Mm-hmm.
I've watched that thing so many times. You talk to ranchers and they watch that thing over and over because it just rings true.
It does.
Obviously we do get to watch TV here, in the evenings, especially in the winter, and there's just so much good wildlife stuff anymore, and people, the thing that is troubling is the Walt Disney effect of, trying to understand nature through, a non-realistic storytelling.
Yep.
Versus, just how it works. And there's a quote by Tennyson, I think it's called "Nature Red in Tooth and Claw," mm-hmm. which is the reality, and we live in a world, that, a mile from here, virtually every day, some mountain lion is killing some deer, mm-hmm. or some coyote's killing a lamb, or some raven is eating sage-grouse eggs. And I think the thing that people, as we get more sophisticated, or hope we do, is understanding how nature really works, not sort of these rumors of how it works.
Yeah, I agree. People don't. I don't think people have a real appreciation for how violent, for lack of a better word, it is. But it's nature. I mean, that's nature. That's what it is. And I think once you can kind of get past some of that initially, it makes it even more magical, I think. This should be funny. Is there some other activity that you enjoy that would be surprising to people who are listening to this?
I don't know about surprising. I'm doing a little bit more, too much traveling, doing political stuff. That's taken a lot of time, and I enjoy it to some extent. But the traveling is getting to be old. And,
yeah, it'll wear you out.
And the other thing is the disconnect of D.C. anymore. I was in the legislature in Wyoming with the Wyoming delegation. I've served with all the senators and congresswomen, and over the years, I've seen things work, but right now it's so dysfunctional. It's really sad. I don't know how we're going to get past that, but that's another reality we need to understand. And actually, it's interesting in Colorado. The two senators are both the kind that you can work with. Mm-hmm. And I heard Bennett last night talking about a bipartisan bill he's doing. You just got to hope that somehow the message gets out that we're not going to ever solve anything by either litigation or this divisiveness.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we're just at a wrinkle in history similar to like 1968 or something, where everybody just goes nuts for a little while and then it calms down. But it's either that or who knows really. Here's a good question. What's the craziest thing that's ever happened to you in the outdoors? You've spent so much time outdoors. If you had to pick one experience that was just crazy? It could be scary, it could be funny. Yeah,
I had a four-wheeler flip over on me a few years ago, and had to crawl quite a long way to find somebody I'd kind of broken a bunch of bones in my pelvis and stuff. And that was probably it.
How far did you have to crawl?
Well, it was up on this big hillside, and what was the scary part is that we raised these rams for our sheep.
Yeah.
That weigh 300 pounds, and we had a bear killing them, and it was in that pasture, and I just thought to myself, I do not want this bear to eat me tonight. So that was. I found out I could be very highly motivated.
Yeah, that'll get you going. Holy cow!
We eventually the trapper got him, and he weighed 517 pounds, which is a pretty darn big bear for this country.
Yeah, that's really big. Holy cow! I think I know the answer to this, but if you had to pick one place that's your favorite location in the West or in the world, where would it be?
Well, there's a place here where the Battle Creek that runs through the middle of this ranch goes in the Little Snake, which is our main river. Pretty magical place. And that's, kind of where I like to go and see things play themselves out. I could go there right now and there'd be 3 bald eagles flying around and fish jumping, and it's just a beautiful spot. It's actually the spot where 175 years ago there was the largest battle between trappers and Indians was there in
Really?
1841. Yeah.
Have you ever found any artifacts or anything in that area?
Yeah, not only have we not, but we've had, the pretty much top archaeological technology trying to find it, but it's right at the confluence, and I'm guessing it all washed away, a long time ago.
Sure.
We really never found anything except there's a lot of documentation of where it was.
Who won the battle?
Well, it was a draw. There was 45 trappers and Shoshone Indians fighting Arapaho, Sioux, and what was the other? 3 tribes. And it was over kind of a combination of stealing horses and beaver hunting, and the implication on this valley, as we understand it, was never any single tribe. Mm-hmm. And it was a lot of different, the hunting was so good. Fremont came through here and said this was the greatest hunting that he saw anywhere, or the greatest wildlife in the West.
Wow. And
it still is great. And so it was sort of cumulative. Everybody came here, but there were lots of battles over it. But this was one, Battle Mountain, which is behind us, and Battle Creek that runs through us are named after that battle.
Oh, okay.
They finally ran out of powder at the same time the Indians quit charging, and the Indians took their horses and they walked from here to Fort Bridger, which is, I'm on the state line, and that's up at I-80, almost to Utah. So that was a long walk.
Yeah. Whenever I hear any of these stories about that, or even just your wife's family coming out here in 1881, it just makes me feel like such a wimp. Those guys are so tough.
Yeah, they were tough.
Okay, so the next to last question, if you could make a request of the people listening to this podcast, what would it be? And like I said, it's generally just people who have an interest in the American West, and it could be from a recreational standpoint or an artistic standpoint or ranching. Is there some request you would have of them?
Well, when I tell people when I came out here, Ed, not only did I not know anything about ranching, all my preconceived notions were wrong. And I think, this is a good time for people to take a breath and think, what is the future going to be? We have a lot of documentation of the past, and we have a lot of experience with conflict. Let's try to see how the future could be better. And there's so much good stuff happening right now all over the place. It's not everywhere, but there's a lot of models to say, hey, there's a lot more in common than there is, in conflict.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great way to end it. And like I said, I'm always happy to hear that at any time. But given where we are in the election cycle, I love hearing that. How can people connect with you and learn more about the ranch? I know you've got a website and any other online stuff people could look up to learn more about the ranch.
ladderranch.com.
Okay.
And my wife does a blog. Not every day, but most days, you go to Ranch News, and there's lots of pictures of grandkids, but lots of pictures of great landscapes, and that, that connects you. For example, our daughter puts together our recreation stuff, and that's a good way to contact her.
Okay.
Also. And
I'll have links to all that on the webpage. So, well, this has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time. I know you're extremely busy, but thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, and look forward to having you come up, Ed.
I will take you up on
your family
that.
Up.
You can put me to work, too.
We can do that.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast, and thanks for listening to that particular episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Before you go, I've got 3 quick things. Number 1, if you like the podcast, please do me a huge favor Either pass it along to a friend who may be interested, share it on your social media, and or go to iTunes and give it a 5-star review. All those things would mean a lot to me, and they would really help to spread the word about the podcast. Number 2, if you've listened to many of these episodes, you know that I love reading and I love talking about books. Every other month, I send out a quick email with a few books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The subjects are varied, but they're pretty much all nonfiction with an emphasis on history, biographies, adventure narratives, and topics related to the American West. There are no sales pitches for ranches, no spam, no other kind of nonsense, just books. So if you'd like to sign up for the list, head to Mountain and Prairie/reading, or just go to Mountain and Prairie and there's a massive tab at the top that says book recommendations. Click on it. There are a ton of good books that I've read. Some of the old email lists are on there. You can go crazy. There are a lot of books. And finally, if you know anyone I should interview for the podcast, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. All my contact info is at mountainandprairie.com, and I'm on all the social media stuff, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, blah, blah, blah. So feel free to reach out. I'd love to have some recommendations and suggestions of interesting people I should meet. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. Talk to you soon.